Hey guys, how's it going? Let's talk about Dark Side of the Ring, the loose cannon, Brian Pillman, episode 1 and episode 2. If you haven't seen my short on episode 1, it wasn't a review, and this is not a review, it's a British fans retrospective thoughts and opinions. I'm not going to go into any in-depth detail about this episode. I'm going to talk about some of the highlights. There will be some spoilers in this, guys, so I'm just making you aware of that. If you haven't actually seen any of these 2 episodes, I highly encourage you go and check out the 2 episodes and then come back and listen to this. Yes, I am a YouTuber, and I am actually openly encouraging you to go and watch something first before you listen to what I have to say, because as I say, this is not a review. This is my actual thoughts and opinions on this subject. So to episode 1, guys. Once again, if you haven't seen my original short, please go check it out, guys. It's on my channel. Episode 1 went into detail about Brian Pillman's early life and career. He had multiple throat surgeries because he had issues with breathing. He was always worried about his size, but he had a big heart and big spirit. And they go into detail and give examples. We got to hear from people like Steve Austin, Jim Ross, some of his family members. One thing that I was absolutely stunned to find out is that I don't know if it was his first wife or his first girlfriend. She actually committed suicide and shot herself. I couldn't believe this. It's something that I had no idea about, but it makes sense with where Brian Pillman was going and the way that he was behaving. Because as much as people talk about the transition between Flying Brian Pillman and the loose cannon gimmick that we're about to talk about, these events that took place behind the scenes are almost pivotal in the development of the loose cannon character. An unhinged Pillman wouldn't have been able to have concocted these ideas. And he was obviously grief-stricken, and he was obviously traumatized by what events had taken place. And it's so obvious to me looking back now that the loose cannon gimmick, although it looks great on paper and it would have played out differently had circumstances not been different, I just don't know if the loose cannon gimmick was mentally a great gimmick for Brian Pillman, having learnt these things about his early life and early career. They didn't go into any detail about his early wrestling career, the likes of the match between him and Justin Thunder Liger that took place in the early 90s. And I'm almost certain that Justin Thunder Liger versus Brian Pillman was the first match on a WCW Nitro broadcast. I might be wrong about that, but I think it was. It was a go-to match that WCW obviously used to elevate the cruiserweight division, because these wrestlers were still being considered as, light heavyweight wrestlers / cruiserweight wrestlers. Although Pillman was trying himself to be moved up the card, and he had been moved up and moved down the card multiple times between the late 80s and early 90s, and eventually he became frustrated with WCW like many did, Steve Austin, Mick Foley, etc. And WCW didn't fire him like they did with Steve Austin and Mick Foley, but you could just tell by the way that it was being explained and the information that has been circulating online for years now, that Pillman himself was just unhappy in WCW and he needed a way out. And this is where we got to hear from a close friend of Brian Pillman and somebody who was a mentor to him. I can't actually remember what this person's name was. He's not actually a wrestling person, but he's known in the wrestling community. He was very instrumental in telling Brian Pillman, or encouraging him, should I say, to just go with the flow and design a character that the fans would have looked at completely different from any character that Brian Pillman had been in the past before. And this is obviously where the loose cannon gimmick comes from. Now, no matter what Eric Bischoff says in this Dark Side of the Ring episode, I strongly believe that Brian Pillman took Eric Bischoff for a ride, no matter what was said or what was believed by Bischoff himself. So in my opinion, I would say that Brian Pillman did con Bischoff with this loose cannon gimmick. They didn't go into much detail about the I respect you Booker Man situation. I think they briefly spoke about it, but they didn't go in depth about that. A lot of people obviously don't understand the severity of this situation. This was just as bad as the curtain call. This was pulling the curtain from behind the wrestling world and saying, you know, this is what the world is about. Basically, this guy, Kevin Sullivan, writes my checks, decides whether I win or lose, and we're in a position where I need to be out of this company, and we're going to play it off that I am being fired by the company because of losing a match, whereas in reality, I've actually been fired in real life. But of course, like we say, because of this loose cannon gimmick, we've now found out or been told for years that, yes, we were being led to believe as the fans that he had been fired, but at the same time, it was all a work. So it's quite still to this day, even after the Dark Side of the Ring episode, it's still quite confusing because he was fired, but at the same time, it was clearly obvious that Bischoff would have brought him back had Bischoff been given the chance to bring him back. So it's difficult. So anyway, Pillman goes to ECW. He is a completely unhinged, just off the rails version of the character that he was in WCW. He was quite eccentric, you know, doing the grabbing Bobby Heenan swearing on live TV, causing problems with WCW, like walking through the crowd, stirring up loads of trouble with people backstage, but no one could tell if he was working them or not. And when he finally got to ECW, people started to see this gimmick for what it was, because he was clearly unhinged and just not thinking straight in the eyes of the people that were watching him. And people obviously in ECW love this. And it wasn't long before he ended up getting this contract with the World Wrestling Federation. But before he got the contract with the World Wrestling Federation, he had a very, very bad car crash. And this is where the drug abuse and the trying to get over the death of his wife and etc., all these things that he's going through all come into effect. Because behind the scenes with Brian Pillman, where he's changed his gimmick, changed the way that he's being looked at, his life is falling apart. And as a wrestler, he's trying to keep the gimmick running. And, you know, for anyone who knows wrestling, they'll know it's not easy to do that. And Brian Pillman was using drugs and painkillers to be able to even function, and he's fallen asleep at the wheel of a car and smashed it into a tree or a lamppost at like 70 miles an hour. And, you know, that was Brian Pillman almost dead. Apparently he flipped over and landed on his head, etc. They go into detail about this car crash, and he had to have his ankle fused. Now, anyone who knows wrestling, you'll know ankle fusion doesn't sound like something that's going to be good for a sportsman or wrestler, which it wasn't. But Brian Pillman, wanting to live the gimmick, healed up but didn't heal up properly, and he was told he would never heal up properly. He had metal plates placed in his face, but he still had something to offer, so the World Wrestling Federation signed him up. And as a personality who could slightly still work in the ring but wasn't going to be a great in-ring wrestler, he still had something to give. But he just wouldn't calm down and decide, like Austin after the broken neck did. He just didn't decide to adapt to the different abilities that he was going to have to be needing to use with the bad ankle and with the hurt body, because he couldn't be the same wrestler that he was, but he wasn't learning. And you could see that when he was in matches in 1997, he was struggling badly. And he was obviously using painkillers and more drugs to try and get over these injuries and the things that he was going through. And in the end, Brian Pillman ended up becoming completely, you know, dependent on painkillers and pain pills and, you know, sleeping tablets, etc. And he was never the same after the injury. And apparently, Jim Ross confessed to this. Jim Ross had him drug tested when he was in the WWF at the time, WWE now, of course. And Brian Pillman seen this as a betrayal. And this is where you get into the paranoia and the you know, overwhelming and outstanding issues that Brian Pillman carried along with him. You've got to understand that all the trauma, and I know that I've spoke quite fast and skipped over things, but all the trauma and all the things that Brian Pillman had been through at this stage were a catalyst in him not wanting to stop. Even at some point, his ex-wife, the mother of his children, she even says that he started speaking like he wasn't going to be around much longer. And it's, you know, it's at this point people like Jim Ross started to see that the gimmick wasn't just a gimmick. This guy was out of his mind. And this is around the time as well where he's doing the angles with Steve Austin. The Pillman's got a gun, all these things. So he's at the height of his career at this point. And of course, he doesn't want to slow down. But the drugs and all that are going to take a toll in the end if you do them on a constant basis, or even if you do them on a semi-constant basis. And they did. And unfortunately for Brian Pillman, he ended up overdosing. And I think he had a heart attack or a seizure or something. And he ended up dying in his hotel room. And obviously this was the end of the life and career of one of the most memorable characters from the early, what you would call early Attitude Era. Just around the time of the NWO era, early Attitude Era, one of the pioneers of professional wrestling. And it's so sad when I look back and think about it, and I think, should Brian Pillman had a chance before these things took place? You know, should he have been a megastar in wrestling long before the time when he became the loose cannon gimmick? And a lot of people would say that, yeah, he probably should have become a lot bigger than he was. But in my opinion, he just didn't. And I've got to say this for a fact. Brian Pillman is one of the most underrated professional wrestlers that have ever lived. When you look at what modern professional wrestling is to this day, he kind of set the trend. Because even though people like RVD got famous, and a lot of people use RVD as an example of professional wrestling in 2021 is very much a modern version of what RVD used to do. Well, RVD was doing that after the likes of Brian Pillman had already been seen on national television doing it. I'm not saying that Rob Van Dam wasn't already doing that, but Rob Van Dam was in that category of guys like Pillman who were smaller but had the ability, because of their ability, to become heavyweights and become champions undeniably. And it's unfortunate for Pillman that he never did become the, you know, NWA or WCW heavyweight champion of the world. I think by the time that he got to the WWF, I don't think he ever would have been the WWF champion, because I don't think he would have had the health-wise, had the strength and ability to carry that belt around the world and around the globe. I think it would have put a strain on his body that you wouldn't have been able to have matched. But overall, I just think that Brian Pillman died way too early. I think it's a tragic story. And I think this is a great example of how powerful the dark side of the ring can actually be. But I'm not going to go on any longer, guys. I really like this episode, or the 2 episodes of Dark Side of the Ring. And I hope you do, and I hope you enjoy it, guys. Please like, share, subscribe, and stay tuned for more.